Hello to you and welcome. My name is Sarah, and here at Hoop Sisters, I have the pleasure of designing and digitizing some fun quilt patterns. So today we're going to talk about hugs and kisses, and specifically, we're going to stitch out the O block of hugs and kisses. So let's just jump right into it. I've already got all of my materials prepped, my fabrics cut, and my optional wool I did cut out, and I pressed the edges to prepare it. I also hooped my battleizer. Now, if you've never heard of battleizer, it's a great product. So it's a batting and stabilizer combination. So I just have one thing in my hoop right here. There's no need to hoop stabilizer with batting on top of it, just the battleizer. It's perfect. It's got movement to it, but it still holds up to dense stitches like a satin stitch. You're not going to see any satin stitches in this particular block. So it'll still have lots of movement to it once we're done stitching. So for step one, you'll want to put a water-soluble thread in your needle and you'll sew the placement stitch. Now the placement stitch for step one is really kind of just the outline of the block that you can see right here. And now we're going to move on to step two. And I will note that I have a red thread in my needle because it's much easier to see on camera, but you'll want to use that water-soluble thread. Okay, for step two, I've got my wool. I cut it to size and I press the edges just to prepare it. All that does is it flattens it to keep your presser foot from getting stuck in that wool. And you do want to raise your presser foot just so it kind of skims right over your wool if you're using it. Now, if you don't like wool, just go ahead and skip that step and move on to number three. But I like it for this one. It adds a lot of dimension to the quilting. So we're going to go ahead and use it. I just have it aligned in my placement stitch, and now we're going to tack this down with water-soluble thread. Okay, now for step three, we're going to sew the placement stitch. And this is essentially the outline of where all your different fabrics are going to be placed on this block using our stitch and flip method. So you'll keep that water-soluble thread in your needle. And again, if you used wool, make sure your presser foot is still high enough that it just skims right over the top of that wool. Okay, so here is our placement stitch. And let me turn on my thread cutter. Okay, so here's our placement stitch. Now we get to start tacking down our different fabrics. So again, I'm still going to keep my red thread in my needle so we can see it nice on camera, but you would still do this step with water-soluble thread. So up until this point, you have not changed your thread. So for step four, we're going to take our background fabric, and I placed it right over the center is where this is going to tack this down, just right over that placement stitch. Peek under each of your edges and corners to make sure that you have nice coverage. and then you can tack this down. Okay, so now that we've got that tacked down, we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna use my hoop scissors. This is just my regular hoop scissors with this nice offset handle. It makes trimming in the hoop much easier. I'm gonna remove my hoop from my machine so I can kind of move it around during this too. So what we need to do now is we need to trim our fabric a scant 1/4 inch from the tack down stitching that we just did. And one of the great things about quilting in the hoop with Hoop Sisters is it's all digitized. So your seams are going to stitch exactly where they need to. Your tack downs are going to stitch exactly where they need to. So when you're trimming your fabric like I am now, it doesn't have to be perfect. If you trim a little more than a scant 1/4 inch or a little less, it's totally fine. Okay, so there is the center of our block. This is our background fabric tacked down and all trimmed. And now for step 5, we're going to switch to our strip of O fabric. So this is a 2.5 inch strip that I cut, just cut 2.5 inch by width of fabric. And what I'm going to do is this is going to be my O fabric. So this is where we'll start that stitch and flip technique to tack down on our fabrics. I'm going to first take it, place it right side down. So right side down, and we're going to sew a seam right along this line. So I want to align the raw edge of my red fabric approximately with the raw edge of my white fabric. You can overlap a little bit to make sure that you have enough fabric at the top, enough of your red fabric. Say you cut your white fabric a little short, you might want to overlap your red a little bit, but approximately even works out most of the time. And now we want a neutral thread in our needle. I'm just going to go ahead and keep my red thread up in my needle and we'll sew our seam. Now for the next step, we're going to take that red piece of fabric. So our O fabric, we're going to turn it right side up, finger press and smooth out. And then still with that same thread in the needle, we're going to sew our tack down. Okay, now before we jump to the next step, we have a little bit of trimming to do. Again, I'm just going to use my regular hoop scissors and we're going to trim about a scant 1/4 inch from that tack down stitching we just completed. Okay, now we're going to do the same step over on this side, over on our left side. So I'm going to take my fabric, place it right side down. My raw edge is approximately even with my white fabric underneath. And with a neutral thread, I'm going to keep that same red thread in my needle. We're going to sew the seam. And again, take our fabric, flip it right side up, finger press and smooth out, and then we'll sew our tack down with that same thread. Okay, and now I'm going to grab my hoop scissors again, and again, trim about a scant 1/4 inch from that tack down stitching. Okay, and now our next few steps, I believe I'm on step 9 through 12, are going to be kind of the same methods for our other 2 corners. So we are going to work through those ones right now. So my fabric's right side down and I'll sew our seam. And then we'll flip our fabric right side up, finger press, smooth out, and sew our tack down. And same trimming right here. So trim about a scant 1/4 inch from your tack down. Now we'll head to the bottom of the O. And this is sewing the seam. I've got my fabric right side down. And then we're turning our fabric right side up, finger press, smooth out, and sew your tack down. Okay, and now we're going to trim it again. So now we're moving on to step 13. Step 13 through 18, and I think even beyond, is the same stitch and flip technique. So if you can do these 4 corners, you can do the rest of this block. So we'll place it right side down, and we're still using our O fabric for these steps. I'm going to turn it right side up, finger press, smooth out, and sew our tack down. Now we're going to trim this part the same way. So what we're going to do, move my hoop a little bit, is we're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch just from that tack down stitching. So let me get this trimmed, and then we'll talk about why I'm leaving some of this excess along the outside edges of the block. So you can see I trimmed a scant 1/4 inch just from those tack down stitches it just completed. I'm going to leave this fabric on the outside edge of my block so that I have something to trim for my seam allowance once we get to that point. You want to make sure you have at least a 1/2 inch of fabric on those outside edges. Okay, now we're going to turn our fabric right side up, and same thing, we'll smooth out and sew our tack down. We're on step 16 right now. Okay, and again, I want to make sure I'm keeping at least a 1/2 inch of fabric on this bottom side, this bottom outside edge of my block. So I'm just going to trim that, making sure I have about that, maybe a little more. And now we're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch from our tack down again. Couple more pieces of red fabric to place, and then we're going to move on to those outside corners. And turn right side up. Again, finger press and smooth out and sew our tack down. And you can kind of see as this is tacking down, I'm not walking away from my machine. I'm staying right here and kind of smoothing my fabric as necessary. We've got some quick trimming to do. Again, on that outside bottom edge, I'm making sure I have at least a 1/2 inch of fabric. But on those inside edges, along where the tack down stitch, I'm trimming a scant 1/4 inch. Okay, one more piece of red fabric. And then we're going to sew our tack down after we flip it right side up and finger press. I'm going to take my hoop off the machine. Ooh, I got to move it a little. And then we'll trim. And when you're trimming in the hoop, one of the biggest tips is really to leave your hoop on a hard, flat surface. You don't want to set it in your lap. If you set it in your lap, you're at risk of putting a little bit too much pressure on the center back of your hoop, which can kind of shift your design a little bit and make some of your quilting not line up, or even your tack down stitches be off. So make sure you're trimming on a hard, flat surface. Okay, so we're moving right along to step 21. So this is where we're just going to take our I have 4 more triangles of background fabric, and we are going to do the stitch and flip method again for these 4 corners. So again, I'm laying my fabric right side down over top of my red, and I'm even going to overlap a little bit. And if you overlap a little bit your white fabric with your background fabric, because yours may not be white. So if you overlap your background fabric with your O fabric, if you have a light fabric on top of a dark fabric especially, this will make sure that that red fabric does not show through on your lighter fabric. Okay, so we've got that seam sewn. We're not going to tack it down quite yet, but we can take it and just flip it right side up and kind of smooth it out. We're going to move along to this corner and do the remaining corners. And then after we get each of our seams sewn, we'll make sure it's finger pressed and smoothed out, and we'll tack it down around the edges of our block with a water-soluble thread. And you do want to make sure you still have a neutral thread in your needle. So I'm still using red so that we can kind of see it a little on camera. But technically I should probably be using one that's a little closer to my white fabric in color. All right, so at this point, before we proceed to step 19, oh, I'm wrong. Step 26 is step 25, sorry, is what we should be on. You want to make sure all your corners are flipped right side up. You've finger pressed it a bit and smoothed it out. Now you want to place a water-soluble thread in your needle, and this is going to sew the tack down around the edges of our block. Oh, and I need a new bobbin, so let me change that really quick. Okay, now we're on to the really fun steps. This is where we get to add the quilting. So first it's the background quilting. I'm going to use a thread that matches my background fabric. And our instructions also say to use a thread that matches your background fabric. If you want to use something that's a little bit of a contrast or something a little lighter or darker, you feel free to do that. But this step 26, is just stitching on the background fabric, which for me is my white fabric. Okay, now we are moving along to our very last step, which is going to show, going to stitch, I should say, the daisy quilting on our O, so on my red fabric. Now, I'll tell you, our instructions say to use a matching thread. You don't have to do that. In fact, I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to use a pink thread. All right. And here is our O block from Hoop Sisters Hugs and Kisses design. Really fun, easy, simple block to make with just such cute little daisy quilting. Thanks for joining us and watching this video, and I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.